Hey, welcome to God Delusion. We're on number 17 now, in chapter 4, entitled Why There Almost Certainly Is No God. Hopefully we'll get through the chapter quickly, and then we'll get to some fun stuff in chapter 5 and following. Okay, he talks about evolved organs, elegant and efficient as they often are, also demonstrate revealing flaws, exactly as you'd expect if they have an evolutionary history. He says many of our human ailments, from lower back pain to hernias, prolapsed uteruses, and our susceptibility to sinus infections, well, I know that one, result directly from the fact that we now walk upright with a body that was shaped over hundreds of millions of years to walk on all fours. Well, he doesn't.
I'm laughing because I'm sitting here thinking, you're just proving, he just proved that evolution. Why would you want to believe in evolution if evolution is the cause of you having sinus problems, back problems, urinary stuff? Why would you want to believe in that?
Oh, he would say, well, he doesn't want to believe in it. It's just he's seeking for the truth, and that's the truth. It's not a good truth, but that's just what it is, so we'll believe it.
But then now he actually has proven that evolution is faulty. Faulty as in anything that is so-called, what do you want to call Big Bang, is all faulty. So this earth is faulty. The human beings are faulty. Everything's faulty. Why in the world would I want to believe in something that is faulty? Maybe that's the reason why so many people want to believe in a God, whether it's the God or it's Allah, Muhammad, Buddha, all the gods of the Hindu. There's more people that believe in a God than there are atheists. Well, probably the reason why they believe in a God, because they think, they believe that God loves you and wants better and, made you better than what evolution has made you, which is faulty.
Actually, what he said is, what he's shown is that his proof for there not being a God is actually proof that there is a God.
Yeah.
I mean, he says, basically what his argument would be, not only does he just automatically dismiss a God who created humans, but he's also making the assumption that God, if he existed, if he made humans, would make perfect humans. And since he didn't make perfect humans with flaws, then there must not be a God. First off, he says, how do you know that these human ailments are a result of a body that was shaped over hundreds of millions of years, from walking on all fours to walk on two? How do you figure that out? How does my blowing my nose constantly have to do with me being an ape hundreds of millions of years ago? How does he draw that conclusion? How does he draw that how does he figure out that the reason for all of these human ailments is because we went from, because of the evolutionary process? What proof does he have that those ailments are caused by that? And what proof does he have that God would make a perfect body? I got plenty of proof that God would not make a perfect body. He did that on purpose. I mean, you think about how intricately the body is made to work, how your body can fight off, your wonderful immune system that can fight off diseases. I mean, it can't fight off everything, but it can fight off a lot of things. There's no cure for the common cold, but yet, if I catch a cold, I will get over it. My body will fight it for me. It will get over it. And that's why the Bible says in Psalm 139, verse 14, I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. You see, Dawkins' assumption that God would make a perfect body is that God is only concerned with the material world. But as we said in the last God Delusion, is that when you believe the gospel, then you know God because you know his love. God's love doesn't mean, it's just like, I've heard Warren Buffett, He's got, I don't know, $500 billion, one of the richest men in the world. He's not going to leave a penny to his children when he dies. Now, that doesn't mean he doesn't love them, but he just knows that just being handed money would corrupt his children. They would, not handle it properly. He knows it's better to give that money to whatever worthy causes he wants to give it to, and then it's better for his children, although they would be taken care of hand and foot if he gave them the money. He knows that's not what's important. The most important thing isn't a physical body that works perfectly and I don't have to lift a finger. Warren Buffett knows that it's better that my children have good morals and be good people and work hard for a living. And so he's purposely not giving them money. He demonstrates his love to his children by not giving them that money. And that's what God does when it comes to our body. He demonstrates his love toward us by not giving us perfect bodies. That's why it says we were fearfully and wonderfully made. The beauty about the human body is that God made it so resilient and that it can last and fight off a lot of things. But at the same time, we're subject to ailments, but yet he makes it to where we can get over those ailments in most cases. So he allows us to suffer, but not overtly so. And that's because what we talked about last time is what's real to God isn't the material world, it's the spiritual. And so if he shows us that our bodies are frail in some respects, then that reduces our pride and trusting in our own flesh so that we see the spiritual realities and desire those over physical well-being. You see this in 2 Corinthians 12. In 2 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about how God gave him an abundance of revelations. And he says in 2 Corinthians 12, regarding these, and verse 7, "And lest I should be exalted above measure through the abundance of the revelations, there was given to me a thorn in the flesh, the messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I should be exalted above measure." In that one verse, Paul says, I've been given abundance of revelations into the spiritual realm. And by the way, you have that too today. If you're a believer, you've been given the Holy Spirit, and you could read Paul's epistles, Romans through Philemon, and learn the same things that Paul learned. But he says, because of the abundance of revelations given to me, there is a danger that I could be puffed up. I could be exalted above measure. I could trust in myself rather than trusting in God. And so what God does is he intentionally gives him a hurt, a thorn in the flesh. Because he says in verse 9, Jesus said unto him, "My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." My strength is made perfect in weakness. If God made the human body perfectly strong, then we would not have Christ's strength. We would rely upon our own strength. And so the beauty about what God did was he made the human body resilient so it could last a long time, but at the same time he made it subject to ailments and frailties that for the most part we get over. I know people talk about, well, you have a terminal disease and we don't know the answer to that. Well, yeah, I know there are cases like that, but for the most part, everybody who lives, if you live long enough, you're going to have some health issue, guaranteed. And if you just let it go, in most cases, your body will eventually heal. I have lower back problems. The chiropractor told me that it would probably go away by itself in 1 to 2 years. I know that's a long time to deal with pain, but it still goes away. So God designs the human body so beautifully that it's resilient, it can fight off things, but at the same time, it allows things to come in that for the most part won't kill you, but you end up suffering so that you don't trust in your own flesh, but you trust in God. Whereas what Dawkins is doing is he's assuming that God would make a perfect body because he's assuming that all that exists is the material realm. God's will, 1 Timothy 2:4, is for all men to be saved and to come into the knowledge of the truth. You're not going to be saved, you're not going to believe the gospel unless you recognize that this world is not all there is. If you don't recognize your frailties, that you will die and go to hell, that you're not sufficient to heal yourself of that common ailment that all of us have, which is we will eventually die. And so the beauty is God does that so that we will be humble enough to believe the gospel and be saved. So when Dawkins talks about, well, there must be evolution because of our frailties, no, that actually shows there is a loving God. Just like Warren Buffett wouldn't give money to his children, God doesn't give us a perfect body, because there are things better than perfect health. There is the love of God. There is the true realities of the spirit realm that God wants us to experience for all eternity in His kingdom, that we wouldn't experience if we had a perfect body because of our pride. Just like Warren Buffett's children would not experience the value of hard work if he just gave them money. So Dawkins' argument that evolution is true based upon the frailty of the body actually demonstrates that it is false. Because evolution, it would have to be something where it gets, according to the theory, it keeps getting better and better. So you would eventually evolve to a perfect body. But yet we don't see that happening. There are frailties. And how can the body continue to operate but yet heal itself, but not all the time and not completely, and all of this? So it shows these ailments doesn't show evolution's true. It shows that God created us. He says, quote, predators seem beautifully designed to catch prey animals, while the prey animals seem equally beautifully designed to escape them. Whose side is God on? End quote. Well, he's on the side of survival is what he's on. And if you say survival of the fittest, then how do you explain that there are animals beautifully designed to escape them? I thought Darwin said survival of the fittest. So how is it that these animals continue to exist? Wouldn't there always be a superior evolved species of animals that would devour the smaller, less evolved species of animals under the theory of Darwinism? But if it was a creator who made animals to help us, then the creator would make them in such a way that they all survive. And that's exactly what God has done. Again, showing God is the creator. The next topic here starts on page 162, is the anthropic principle, planetary version. The rest of the chapter is going to be this anthropic principle, and this is really hokey. You thought the other stuff was bad. This is even worse. He says, quote, the origin of life only had to happen once. We therefore cannot allow it to have been an extremely improbable event, end quote. Now, wait a minute here. I thought before in these other chapters, you got rid of evolution. You got rid of creationism because it was just so improbable. It's beyond a statistical possibility that creation could have happened by an intelligent designer. Therefore, you threw it away. But yet, under your own evolutionary theory, you're saying that it was an extremely improbable event, and yes, you're going to trust that to be true. A rational person thinking with logic and not blind faith in something does not side with such a great improbability, but yet Dawkins does, which shows that atheism and evolution is based upon myth. It's based upon unfounded theories. It's not based upon any rationality or logic at all. He continues, so when the origin of life came, he says that had been an extremely improbable event. And then, quote, subsequent evolutionary steps are duplicated in more or less similar ways throughout millions and millions of species independently and continually and repeatedly throughout geological time, end quote. Well, my question is, how can any rational thinking person believe this? You just told me that the origin of life is extremely improbable, but that's okay because it would only have to happen once. Now, subsequent evolutionary steps isn't as improbable, therefore they could happen, but he says it happens throughout millions and millions of species independently. So if it happens throughout millions and millions of species independently, then all of these steps, millions and millions of steps, or the same steps done independently, which is millions and millions instances of the same steps, had to have all happened just by chance. Oh, it just happened to be this way. Oh, it's natural selection. Well, again, as I go through this chapter, he never defines what natural selection is. How does that happen? It is by chance, really, because he hasn't given any rational thinking as to how it logically happens. So, first off, you're trusting in an extremely improbable event, the origin of life, to take place, and then millions of improbable, but not as improbable, but still improbable events taking place after that. Again, that is beyond the realm of statistical possibility for all of this to happen. It is far greater statistical impossibility than for a God to create everything. God creating everything makes perfect sense. Rational, logical thinking people would not go by the evolutionary theory. They are taking it in without faith. It's a myth. It's a superstition. He says, quote, the events that constitute run-of-the-mill evolution as distinct from its singular origin and perhaps a few special cases cannot have been very improbable, end quote. Well, he's just saying they're not very improbable, but he still says they're improbable. So if it's improbable, how can that exist? How can that happen? I'll get into that a little more pretty soon here. Let's move on. He says, quote, God is one, the anthropic principle is the other. They are alternatives. So he's saying that there are two candidate solutions for the problem of creation. One is the anthropic principle, and the other is God. Well, God makes a lot more sense than what he's just proposed, a very improbable event, and then millions and millions of subsequent improbable, although less improbable events, all taking place. Just so happens that they take place. And I'll get into that a little more as he goes through the example. He says, quote, the origin of life may have been a highly improbable occurrence, end quote. Well, then why do you believe it? Why do you believe? Well, just because we're alive. Okay, you're alive, so you know that the origin of life took place. But why are you believing in a very highly improbable explanation for the origin of life? Quote, once the vital ingredient, some kind of genetic molecule, is in place, a true Darwinian natural selection can follow, and complex life emerges as the eventual consequence, end quote. Okay, so even though it's very improbable to happen, it can still happen, but it's based upon the assumption that the vital ingredient, some kind of genetic molecule, which he calls perhaps the related molecule RNA or DNA, one of those, either DNA or RNA or something like that, was the vital ingredient, the genetic molecule for Darwinian natural selection to follow. Well, the question is, where does the DNA or the RNA come from? As we've talked about before, DNA has two strands, and each DNA strand has 250 different proteins in it. The instructions for just one single strand of DNA would cover 30 Encyclopedia Britannicas. That's how much information, 20 Encyclopedia Britannicas. Not books, but the entire volume. 25 books of Encyclopedia Britannicas times 20. So like you think of an entire set multiplied by 20. That's how much information is in one strand of DNA, and there are two strands in a single molecule. So how is it that this vital ingredient just happened to come about? So even if Darwinian natural selection is true, and that we evolve over billions of years, this origin of life is, he says it's very improbable, but when you look at DNA and something that he says you have to have the vital ingredient, some kind of genetic molecule, and you see how complex a DNA strand is, then it is really statistically impossible for just a simple DNA strand to form randomly. So he says it's highly improbable, but the statistical is really impossible for that to happen. But he just says very, very improbable. He says the probability of its happening is and always was exceedingly low. end quote. But now he's going to explain how it happened, even though it is very, very improbable. And I say statistically impossible. Well, the way he gets it from the statistically impossible category to the highly or very, very improbable category is what he's going to explain next. And this is the big kicker. He says, quote, "It has been estimated that there are between 1 billion and 30 billion planets in our galaxy and about 100 billion galaxies in the universe." End quote. So he says, well, it's easy to understand that he says DNA, quote, "suppose it was so improbable as to occur only on only 1 in a billion planets," end quote. So what he's saying is that there are 1 to 30 billion planets in our galaxy. I don't know how he came up with that. So far, we only discovered 9. When I was a kid, we had 9, and now we only have 8 because they took Pluto away. So there's 8 planets, but yet he's in the Milky Way galaxy, but yet he's saying that there are really 1 to 30 billion planets just in our galaxy. How in the world do you come up with that? You've only discovered 8, but now there's suddenly at least 1 billion. And then on top of that, there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe. So let's assume that there are just 1 billion planets in our galaxy. Let's say these numbers are true. And there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe, which means there are 100 billion planets. So basically what he's saying is that although DNA is so improbable to occur randomly, when you consider that there are at least 100 billion planets in the entire universe, then you know that at least DNA should at least have a statistical probability of at least 1 in 100 billion, or at least 1 in a billion. So if it's 1 in a billion and there are 100 billion galaxies, there must be at least 100 planets in the entire universe, 1 in each galaxy, that supports life, that has life on it. Well, I don't know if you noticed that, but what he just did created a huge problem, incredibly huge, something that he been trying to explain the origin of life. He just created a much, much bigger problem. Let me give you an illustration to show you what I mean. Let's say I meet somebody. I've never met him before. He's, say, 22 years old, real young guy. And I'm just chatting him up. I say, so what do you do for a living? He says, oh, I don't work. I'm independently wealthy. And I said, oh, that must be nice. You know, I wish I had said, how'd you get independently wealthy? How did you, somebody inherit a bunch of money? He says, oh, no, I didn't do that. He says, I won the Powerball. I won a $200 million jackpot in the Powerball. And so I don't have to work a day in my life. Well, congratulations. Boy, you sure are a lucky person to win the Powerball. I know my chances are so slim, I won't even try. How? Then his response is, oh, well, it wasn't luck, it was skill. What do you mean it's skill? The Powerball, they just got like these numbers on these balls and then they come out randomly. And did you fix it? Oh, no, I didn't fix it, but it was skill. I had to win. Well, how is that? Well, I bought every ticket. He says there are 292, and this is a fact, I looked it up. Your chance of winning the Powerball jackpot is 1 in 292 million. So he says, it's not luck that I won, I just bought 292 million tickets. So I was guaranteed to win. Okay, what's the problem with that? The problem with that is that there are, in order to buy 292 million tickets at $2 each, you had to have $584 million in order to buy the tickets. So if you had how did you get the $584 million? To change the Powerball from a skill, from a luck to a chance, you have to get the odds in your favor, you have to buy $584 million worth of tickets, so it's not luck anymore. And the problem is, if I have $584 million, why am I spending it to win $200 million in the Powerball? That's exactly what Darwin has done with his, Dawkins has done with his explanation. He says, oh, well, there are at least 100 billion planets out there, so at least 1 out of a billion would by chance come up with the origin of life. So we got rid of the statistical improbability of DNA. But what you did was you created 100 billion planets. Where in the world did 100 billion planets come from? You look at the Earth and the sun, and how the sun orbits around the Earth, and you got all these other planets out there. There are all these orbits, and there's so much order with our planetary system here. You just created 100 billion out of thin air, such systems in the universe, all with order, all with planets, all with stars. There's heat, there's coldness, there's all this matter, there's air, there's light, there's all this stuff, 100 billion of them in order to explain life. You just created a much bigger problem in that who created the 100 billion different planets out there, the 100 billion different galaxies, and the order to them. So yeah, you explain the origin of life. All you did was change the origin of life from a statistical impossibility to being very, very improbable. But in order to explain how we got on this planet in our life, what you had to do was create something far greater, 100 billion galaxies just poof, appearing out of nothing. Somehow all this matter and energy was there to create all of this stuff that's just floating out there, but yet in an orderly fashion in 100 billion different galaxies. You expect me to believe that? You just made it, but your explanation made evolutionary theory even worse.